Welcome to the Big Rethink, brought to you by New Cities. I'm your host, Greg Lindsay. This is the episode for November 16, 2020. The pandemic's second wave is here. London and Paris are in lockdown, while 48 out of 50 American states are experiencing unchecked spread, with more than 140,000 new cases in the US daily. As of last week, more than 241,000 Americans have died from COVID, among 1,240,000 people worldwide. My guest today is Diana Lind, a New Cities housing fellow and author, Brave New Home. She'll be on momentarily to talk a bit about her book and, of course, the next 4 years in America with regards to housing policy. But before we get started, as always, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from unceded Indigenous lands. The Kanekihaka Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters in which I am joining you today virtually. I would encourage you to go to native-land.ca to learn more about the territory that you are joining from. But with that, let us cue up the slides. So, of course, the big news as of this episode is the United States presidential elections, still somewhat unresolved, obviously, as state results come in. And of course, as President Trump does not quite acknowledge the election results and what, depending on how you look at it, may be a soft electoral college coup or laying the groundwork for Trump TV. It depends on whether your sources rhyme with Shavanka. But as you can see here, Vice President Biden appears to have a lock on the presidency and is being acknowledged as the winner after putting the blue wall back together, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, in addition to flipping two Sunbelt states, Arizona and Georgia, recount results pending. This, of course, this outcome is, of course, the result of the ongoing demographic shifts in the United States, particularly with regards to metros turning ever more blue and rural areas turning ever more red. This was the case in Michigan, as you can see here, according to New York Times graphics, as areas like Detroit, Ann Arbor, and Grand Rapids shifted more blue. Grand Rapids, of course, is interesting because that is the home turf of the DeVos family, Betsy DeVos, the education secretary there. But we can also see this particularly in Georgia, where Metro Atlanta, which had already begun to go significantly blue in the last presidential election, with Gwinnett County and others shifting towards the Democrats, went massively blue this time. And in the story in Arizona, of course, is Maricopa County, which encompasses most of Phoenix, where you can see a massive blue shift across that metro area, turning that state. And this, of course, has implications with regards back to housing policy, and we'll talk about this with Diana, because the inability of states of high-cost coastal metros and states like California and the Bay Area has been driving people into swing states and former swing states like Arizona, Colorado, and Texas. And the story was slightly different, of course, in Florida this time around, where we could see that that Miami-Dade County went significantly to the right, and this is, of course, in part because of the Cuban population. Proof that, of course, cities are ultimately fractal, and as you drill down, you can sort of see the interesting divides in all of them. But as Vice President Biden assumes to plan for the presidency, we've already starting to see some of his transition team and policymakers come into view. And of course, the list for Department of Transportation. This is a screenshot of the transition team that's currently reviewing the Trump administration's work. Our pal Gabe Klein, formerly head of DOTs in Washington, D.C. and Chicago, who was on Commotion Live a few weeks ago as part of that team. And we can also see, that there's already a team in place over at HUD as well. And of course, cabinet secretaries are already being floated. We'll ask Diana about this in terms of who a particular favorite is, if not horse racing here. But, Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti is widely considered to be the front runner for DOT. I think HUD is a little more unclear, but I think many of us are in favor of Diane Yentl of the Low Income Housing Coalition. But we'll talk about a bit about that. And then, of course, there's the Biden housing plan itself. And while not as ambitious as some of those, of his other Democratic contenders, like Senators Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, the Biden plan would be incredibly progressive, including $640 billion earmarked for housing, making Section 8 an entitlement, basically a sort of right for housing for all Americans. And as you can see here, some of the plans here about, interest, of course, on affordability, about access to jobs, about investing in energy and resilience, if not quite a Green New Deal. So again, while the left wing of the progressive wing of the American Democratic Party might be disappointed by this, there is a lot to like in there as well. And this is all, of course, playing out against the continued dynamics of the U.S. housing market. We'll talk a bit about this with Diana as well today. Here you can see this is data from Freddie Mac showing that Americans are continuing to use low interest rates to pull money out of their homes. You can see that while while, of course, what's happening now comes nowhere near the 2006 bubble. Americans are pulled out $40 billion in debt out of their homes through refinancing so far, increasing the K-shaped recovery that we've talked a lot about. And this is a story from Ryan December, of course, previous guest here on the Big Rethink, about how, of course, American Homes for Rent and Invitation Homes and new competitors here are continuing unabated to basically stockpile single-family homes for rent, another massive driving trend here when it comes to housing affordability. But elsewhere on election day, there were several other significant referendums that were passed. On the good side of the ledger, I would argue, is Austin, Texas, voting to tax itself $7 billion on transportation. This comes against the backdrop of Austin having basically rejected two previous referendums along these lines, and against the backdrop of other Sunbelt metros in recent years failing to pass such measures. Nashville in 2018, we've talked a little about here on this webcast and also on the Commotion podcast. And of course, Atlanta voters, suburban Atlanta voters, I should note, in Gwinnett County, again rejected measures to increase transit spending there too. So a mixed bag across the South. And then of course, this is one of my favorite memes here, but this of course is Prop 22 in California, where Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, and others massively spent to convince California voters to deregulate the gig worker economy, leading to critics like this to basically compare it to sharecropping. And you can see at the bottom of this meme that the data is the new land, that it is the essential resource for gig workers, and that they need more protections. And so, this might be beyond the scope of Diana today, but we'll talk a bit about this as well, because this, of course, intersects with housing. But in climate news, with Higher Ground, our New City's inaugural climate migration conference approaching, we've seen that once again, California has basically unilaterally forced insurers to continue insuring high-risk properties in wildfire zones. This, again, compared and contrasted with what Florida is also doing with flood insurance, sort of shows the perverse incentives that are happening in these high-risk areas, that rather than having frank conversations about how we move and plan to move people out of these areas, we're instead kicking the can down the road, enforcing the right to people to live here, but increasing the future losses. So this is something we're going to talk a bit about in just a few weeks at Higher Ground. Here you can see satellite views of the wildfire areas in Oregon, and we start to see just how scarring these increasing wildfires are. But on the other good news side of the ledger, of course, is the big news that Pfizer passed preliminary results, albeit without much data, showing that its vaccine, currently in phase 3 clinical trials, is more than 90% effective. Just last week, Dr. Anthony Fauci also hinted at a Financial Times event that Moderna's vaccine, based on a similar technique targeting the spike protein in coronavirus, is also poised to be equally successful, meaning that there is, in fact, a light at the end of this particularly dark tunnel. And as you can imagine, US stocks reacted accordingly to the Pfizer news. Zoom fell 5.5%, while of course airline stocks rose 20%, Disney was up 10%, and hints of somewhat of a return to normal on the other side of this. But there is really no going back, of course, to our previous world. We've seen the ongoing economic carnage happening to our cities. This is Yelp data showing that, yes, that basically 61% of restaurants in its database may be permanently closed, 58% of retail as well. And you can see that, again, this is unevenly distributed here. Large coastal metros like Los Angeles, New York, and San Francisco bearing the brunt of these large closures here, which of course is fueling the trends of delivery and whatnot that we're seeing. And it's also fueling the debate here about what to do with this former real estate that was once devoted to work, to shopping, to food. Of course, renewed calls to think about what if we convert Midtown Manhattan, still a ghost town, into affordable housing. REEF has raised another $1 billion from SoftBank and others to think about converting many of the parking lots in its portfolio into something more permanent than, of course, its various food trucks and other lightweight uses, but thinking about reusing that real estate. And the New York Times, Connor Doherty, who joined us at our housing conference this summer, wrote a piece about cul-de-sac, which is a sort of venture-fueled $170 million investment to rethink about what the car-free future of American real estate can look like. So there are, of course, a lot of opportunities and visions that are swirling behind us. All right, with that, I'd like to welcome Diana onto our virtual stage. You want to come on out, Diana? Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
All right, Diana. So obviously your timing of writing a book on housing, I mean, pandemic aside, excellent timing here with the potential change in administrations. I should say, let's hope there is indefinite change here, upholding the will of the American voters, which of course will bring a breath of fresh air into American housing policy. So I guess as a first step here, can you talk a bit about the book itself, Brave New Home, your overarching thesis, and sort of what is the evolution of American homes, particularly now that we spend 99.9% of our time in them?
Yeah. Well, so I think kind of playing off of some of the themes that you just brought up in your opening presentation, the book, in a sense, is really about demographic shifts in the United States. So the book, it looks at the history of single-family housing and then new alternatives to it today, and why changing housing could help us solve some of the social, economic, and environmental problems in the US. So, the United States has, predominantly had single-family homes in most of its residential neighborhoods across the country. And a lot of that housing was really built in the past century with a demographic in mind of, say, like a white heteronormative family of four, where, someone commutes into the city every day, and that you don't need to have necessarily like access to immediate amenities. And so this, housing typology that we have across the US was really, sort of built in this perhaps like 1950s mindset. Meanwhile, the US has really changed, both in terms of its diversity of the population and in terms of the lifestyles that people are leading. And, to get to your point about how people's housing preferences or the way that they're living has changed during COVID, that idea of being able to access your neighborhood much more easily, walking and biking rather than taking transit, for example, or driving a car, that has really also, I think, changed the way that people see their homes. So the book looks at, how we went from a type of housing types in the early parts of the country, really prior to World War I, that were much more diverse. And so people think of this sort of white picket fence, house with a white picket fence, as being the way that we've lived in the US forever. And it's really not the truth. It's really the way that we've lived for a few decades now. But for the majority of this country's history and really humankind's history, we've had much more communal styles of living, much more flexible styles of living, much more affordable styles of living. So that would be things like, boarding houses and apartment hotels and tenements and single room occupancy buildings. This kind of plethora of housing types really kind of existed in many of our cities. And then, an array of different policy interventions, media, popular movements really encouraged both homeownership and a move to suburbs and to the single family home. And, that part of history is, I think, pretty well known, but what has happened now is there is really this mismatch between the housing types that exist and the kinds of housing that I think people actually want. And it doesn't have to be all Americans. I've had conversations with people saying, well, lots of people like their, house with a backyard and a 2-car garage, and that is totally fine. We're a really big country in the US, and you could have still 50 million people who want to live differently, which is a, relatively small percentage of the population, but it's still a huge number of people. So the second part of the book really looks at, what are these different types of living? And I kind of give 4 different examples here. The first one being co-living. So, living arrangements where people have private spaces and also sort of more public and shared spaces with programming, sometimes with kind of a co-living operator, or it's more of like a mom and pop operation. And then explore accessory dwelling units and tiny homes and the ways in which this type of housing could be a housing solution for people who want to have, a rental property, people who want to house a loved one, or for, people who can't afford really more than 200 square feet. I also look at multi-generational housing and some of the solutions, or rather some of the lack of the solutions that we've found in the US, and finally, kind of wellness-oriented communities. And so I think that all of these trends, in terms of how they play out in COVID, they are, things that I think that are being looked at in a different way now. Like, people have asked me, is anyone going to want to live in a co-living arrangement anymore? And I certainly think that yes, they will actually, because a lot of people right now are experiencing loneliness and a lack of community, and that type of living situation, I think, especially when it's safe, is going to be even more popular afterwards. Multi-generational living, certainly lots of people are moving in with extended family members right now. And I think that's only going to be even more popular as people have recognized that it's really important to have someone, perhaps someone from your family who can help look after your kids, or just help around the house or bring in economic resources. So I definitely think that, the single family home is not going away anytime soon, but I think what's really exciting is that there are a lot of new housing options that are getting a bit more traction and visibility and kind of conversation out there that are, I think, going to just continue to become more and more popular, even despite COVID.
What happens in terms of affordability of this? I mean, like right now, of course, is a golden age to be a homeowner or home buyer. Again, as part of the K-shaped recovery, if you have the down payment, the money is practically free with interest rates this low. So that part isn't a problem. But obviously, we've seen the so-called COVID flight out of Manhattan and the Bay Area. People realizing that with no longer having to commute to their jobs, they can now basically head to the cheapest home they want. I guess what's sort of part of your prescription about how America should think through this? Because building affordable housing in some of the most desirable cities in America has been an abject failure for the most part. And also there's the secondary trend, of course, where, you're in Philadelphia, that's where rents are going up because people are moving to secondary cities and tertiary cities where, you get all the urban amenities, but at much less cost, and you can still keep your coastal metro job kind of thing. So I'm curious how COVID sort of scrambled that and what your prescriptions are there.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously lots of people are taking advantage right now of the low interest rates. And I think that's an example of really where we've seen somewhat like this two-facedness about how we actually, like the lip service that we give to affordability and to addressing inequality, and the way in what we actually do. And so what we actually do is that we've given a tremendous tax loophole to the people who can, who don't really need another one, right?
And the Biden administration, even in their own documents, talk about homes as a way of building wealth. Like this
Absolutely.
is the way of building wealth while we try to make it affordable.
Totally. And that's really like what I get at in the conclusion of the book, which is that, we have spent a century essentially perfecting home ownership as a wealth creation mechanism for a fraction of our population, and it works really well for that set. But that's increasingly an older and whiter population. And so what do you do about everyone else who is not really able to get into that market? And so, it's not only people who are like in white flight, it's a lot of city people who are continuing to live in the city and buy second homes in a lot of places because they can do that. And like you said, you're essentially punished not for, for not taking advantage of kind of low interest rates. So, so I think that if we are really going to address affordability in this country, and if we are really going to try to address inequality, we have to recognize the role that homeownership plays in that, and the ways in which our policies are really aligned towards helping people who don't need help. And I also think that we have to think about moving beyond homeownership as a way to create wealth, because it creates all these other problems like gentrification, like you're talking about. I mean, if all of your assets are really tied up in your home, you're first of all going to be very protective of that, and that's going to bring out your NIMBYist instincts because you don't want to see your property values go down, and that's a totally rational thing if that's like all of the money that you have. But it's also probably not how you think of yourself as like a citizen, and what kind of city you want to live in. And it also really turns people into gentrifiers, even if they don't really want to be. They're going into places where they can afford the housing, but with the expectation that the housing prices are going to go up because they need that appreciation to kind of like subsidize their investment in their home. And so that, that's not a great thing either. So, housing is both where people live and a commodity, and that's really tricky. And I think that we need to be exploring some kind of other types of wealth creation mechanisms, and also thinking about like how to build community wealth rather than could, for example, rather than investing in that second home for, yourself, which you may not even, not to say you don't want it, right? I'm sure a lot of people want a second home and whatnot, but don't really need it even, could be happy Airbnb or whatever. It'd be great to get those people who have this like excess capital to be able to invest in their neighborhood and get a return that is reasonable for them and feel good about, how they're contributing back to their community and not really looking at it as, some commodity that they have to flip and get their money out of.
Interesting. I know you're not a housing analyst, but I'm curious if you've had a chance to take a look at some of the Biden housing plans and what in particular might interest you in that. I mean, particularly the whole notion of Section 8 as an entitlement, which we know would give Americans a stake in homeownership across the board.
Yeah. So, I think that's the most exciting thing that from my perspective in terms of the housing plan. Making Section 8 an entitlement, I think would really dramatically change how people are able to access housing in their communities. And I think that to your point though, there's continued to be a focus on home ownership and sort of how we build home ownership across the board. And I would love to see some ways in which there's a little bit more of kind of like progressive thinking on that. I also think that there's, there's prior to the whole election season, I'm not really quite sure where the status is of this particular bill, but the YIMBY Act that was a bipartisan act around this idea that you really can't get access to federal funding if you're going to have restrictive and exclusionary housing. That kind of thinking, I think, is really exciting, and it kind of requires a bit more coordination in terms of the funding that's given out. So I think that essentially, incentivizing municipalities to think about how they are addressing their restrictive zoning is really exciting. And I think it would actually get, some cities to rethink like what their policies look like.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. I would say that variations in that plan were hallmark of, I think of, Representative Ocasio-Cortez has talked about, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has talked about this, and Senator Sanders, but I also talked about this with Brookings Jenny Schuetz, and Jenny was the impression that the wealthiest, most restrictive communities don't rely on federal funds that much. So it'll be interesting to see how big a stick it is for many of those most NIMBY suburbs. But I'm curious also, talking about sort of the lifestyle changes after COVID, I was wondering if you could unpack that a bit further, because it is interesting. On the one hand, you have the hardcore demography, right? That if the suburbs and single family homes are created as vehicles in which to raise children, there is a declining number of children. Basically, the echo boom is declining there. But at the same time, you have this sort of COVID flight of like, I need to get the biggest possible house I have. Is there a risk that we're going to end up all alone in giant homes out in the suburbs? And do you think intergenerational housing is something that'll here to stay? I've seen some really provocative ideas of overlapping kin networks and multiple generations, and it will have large homes because they will serve all of our uses with all of our family members. I don't know. I'm curious what you think will stay, especially now that, with the promise of a vaccine, normalcy, maybe around the corner for 2021.
Right. So a couple of thoughts. That idea of the big family home, the multi-generational home, like that was the way that a lot of housing was built, actually. And it was built to be flexible. So I don't necessarily think that like bigger is worse per se. I do think that like a 4,000 square foot house for just a couple is excessive and not necessary. But I could see, 4,000 square feet actually serving a multi-generational family quite well. And so, the type of housing that people had in the 1800s, a lot of people had large houses because they wanted that flexibility. And so it was, having a border at some point in your, at some point was very, very normal. And so that kind of like large house with a lot of flexibility idea, ways to house, some part of your family, I think that that's a great idea. And I do think that a lot of people have realized like we are interdependent, and that's okay. We're interdependent on our family members and on our friends. And so I also think that for a lot of people, they're going to have this experience of kind of potting up. And it's going to just sort of like reinforce the ways in which they're really focused on connecting with a small community or their family members. And I think that is going to be here to stay. And I think one great thing about that is that, part of this idea of the single family home is the notion that somehow you're less than for living with your family. I mean, we see it in the media in terms of how the phrasing doubling up is the way that we talk about, generations living together. I think that there's a way in which this experience is going to change people's minds, that like, this is not necessarily a bad thing. Certainly there's going to be a lot of people who are saying like, this was hell, I can't wait to move out from, have my family move out and so on. But I think a lot of people are going to be excited about it. The other thing though, is like, I just don't see people in their 20s saying that like, given the choice, my choice is going to be that like, after having spent 18 or maybe 22 years living at home, that they don't want to test out their life in a city. I would see, for example, co-living being attractive to them and continuing to be attractive. I would just continue to see them being excited about the opportunities in cities. And so I don't see that really changing. And I think that, even today, I mean, people have talked about how the youngest people are the ones who are most enthusiastic about getting back to their office. And they're probably the ones who are, willing to sacrifice space just to be close to their job, to be close to other amenities.
We talked a bit about the policy aspect, but obviously, housing is provisioned massively by the private sector in the United States, almost by definition. I'm curious, because I think we have time for maybe one more question or two. But what are the most interesting developments you've seen, and also typologies that you've seen? Like, are there any particular fascinating projects to you that stand out? I mentioned cul-de-sac, of course, at the outset here. Common is out there, Brad Hargreaves, co-living provider. They're developing a prototype co-living, co-working space. Like, there's some really interesting mashups and hybrids that are coming out there. What stands out to you as an exemplar of what these new typologies after the single family home should be?
Okay, well, you sort of stole one of my answers there. I would have said that I think that RFP for a more inclusive kind of community where you could work from home, also live there, have some community, that kind of development, I think is going to be just increasingly popular. So one of the examples that I have in the book is Serenity, which is one of essentially an intentional community that is also, it's a developed community trying to rethink the suburban model with kind of walkability and community in mind and so on. It's probably very unique, and it's not the type of thing that's super scalable. And I don't know that any of these examples are going to be super scalable, but I could imagine that we're going to see a lot more of that kind of all-inclusiveness, if you will, of a type of community. And it doesn't necessarily have to be all by one private developer. So it could end up being something more like this, 15-minute city or proximity city, which is in some sense a larger and more diversely funded and supported and integrated kind of example of a type of community. So I see hyper local and proximity economy as being incredibly important going forward. Whether that ends up being, oriented just around the housing, I'm not entirely sure that we'll see a ton of that. I think that, one of the most interesting things that I have seen in terms of different types of housing from the private sector is this idea of like, we'll build it for you if you, share the rent back to us, that kind of accessory dwelling unit, because recognizing that for so many people, building an accessory dwelling unit is just financially really difficult. And in terms of like their expertise and actually, going through permits and getting a contractor, all that kind of stuff. So taking some of that weight off of the homeowner and then, getting a piece of the rent and income afterwards, I think is kind of an interesting idea. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, because the flip side of this question I want to ask is what are some of the worst trends in this, or some of the most predatory ones? Because if you take that logic far enough, you get into some of these startups that are not just offering debt to would-be homeowners, but equity, and also demanding that they sell their homes after 3 or 5 years. A handful of these startups to unlock that equity, like the increasing desperation to get into that ownership path before it's too late, and you're seeing that. And yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm curious also your thoughts as a final question here about, what are the trends in the housing that worry you or do you think are alarming? And this I go back to, we've had on the Big Rethink Ryan December talking about the threat to homeownership posed by the single family rentals, but also, we've seen Open Door, we talked about the need to decommodify housing. Instead, we've seen the increasing financialization of housing with a lot of the, the e-buyers and whatnot, iBuyers, I should say. So where do you think the next housing crisis is, or what do you think is the next danger to American homeowners or American residents?
Yeah, I think a huge threat is this idea of just our housing stock becoming price fixed by a couple of companies, whether it's because they're renting it or whether because they're buying it, cities no longer, or communities no longer being essentially independently owned by thousands and millions of homeowners or renters, but really that all becoming consolidated under a very small number of owners. I think it's a problem that we've seen just in every other industry, like retail, for example. And so it just seems very clearly coming for housing. And we didn't get a chance to really talk about like who's going to be the HUD secretary and whatnot. But I guess the thing that I would really be interested in is someone who's keeping an eye on that, because it feels like we are constantly sort of 20 years behind the ball on a lot of these kinds of issues. And sort of someone who's able to look forward thinkingly at like, what are the threats here, and recognize, for example, that like the threat in 2008 following the foreclosure crisis wasn't just that people were going to be foreclosed upon. It was going to be who's going to buy those homes. And the fact that like that opened up such a wellspring for private investors to buy up tens of thousands of homes. So someone who can be forward thinking on that kind of stuff, I think is going to be really important. That I would say, and just being very concerned about the amount of people who are entering the homeownership market right now with the expectation that they're going to have a job a year from now, with the expectation that, they're not going to be, someone who's going to be foreclosed upon, or that there's not going to be some kind of housing crash in the future. It just seems like we are entering a housing bubble phase, and that there's already in the works like the potential for a major recession here, and not enough awareness of that. So I think, again, that just drives all the urgency for thinking about other ways of creating wealth beyond just home ownership.
Yeah, there was a thought-provoking column by John Dizzard in the Financial Times who pointed out that these are salad days for the underwriters. We've seen Quicken Loans rush out an IPO that they're writing out huge amounts of loan volume, but we know that there's a looming evictions crisis that we didn't have a chance to discuss here. That's coming. That's been forestayed by the federal government, and you can start to imagine where we finally go over that cliff, and that's coming in the coming months, kind of thing. We could talk about this forever, but it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us, Diana.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's great.
All right. Well, thank you all for watching. We'll be back next week with another episode of The Big Rethink. And until then, stay safe and take care.